Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name's Repeat Ron, and today we're going to be talking about Gunner's Overclocks, going over each of them, my opinions about them, and we're going to be talking about the pick rates over here on Karl.gg. This is the site. This is a site that is also a calculator, so you can build your own stuff up in Deep Rock and see what your total stats and everything would be. The stats that we have are from update 34. This was before the new primary weapons were added, so we don't have numbers exactly on how high their pick rate is, both in terms of how often people take the weapons and in how often people pick different overclocks. But we still have the older weapons, so we still got the minigun, the autocannon, revolver, and burst pistol to talk about. And first up we have the minigun, which the minigun has 7 different overclocks, and the minigun's highest picked overclock is Leadstorm with 30%. That's not too surprising. Leadstorm's a pretty appealing option for the minigun. It gives you a lot of single target damage. And the least picked overclock for the minigun would be the thin drum walls, which is a clean overclock at only 4.3% pick rate. Still not one of the lowest pick rates that we've seen, at least percentage wise, but kind of low compared to some of the other overclocks that we got here. So starting off with the clean overclocks, our first one is a little more oomph. A little more oomph has a 14.24% pick rate, which is pretty good, I would say. A little more oomph is probably one of my favorite overclocks for the minigun. This one is very straightforward. It just gives you one more damage point, and it makes your spin up time a little bit quicker. If you take this with the tier 4 spin up time, then you're left at a 0.1 second spin up, so you pretty much have no spin up on the minigun. You can start shooting immediately. I really like that. The extra damage is pretty nice for the minigun, and it's really flexible how you can build it. I can see why this one has a pretty decent pick rate, but maybe not super high. I don't think there's anything wrong with a little more oomph. I wouldn't change it at all. I think it's a good overclock, and it works really well with really any build that you want to go with the minigun. Then we have our least picked overclock, which is the thin drum walls at the 4.3%. This gives us 300 more ammo and a little bit better cooling rate. This also technically makes it so your cooling is a little bit faster, I believe, because I think anything that messes with the cooling rate on the minigun also depends on the cooling speed. I could be wrong about that. It might just be this particular overclock that has something like that. So extra ammo and extra cooling rate is pretty nice on the minigun. I don't really think that there's much to be changed about this one, even though it is the least picked. It's probably because the minigun already has a lot of bullets. This is half of your tier 2, but I mean, it comes with no downsides, so you get half a tier 1, half a tier 2 with this, which is pretty nice. So I feel like the only thing you could really do to change this one, if you wanted to buff it, would be to just give it more ammo or give it a faster cooling rate or both. Maybe make it just so that it is the tier 2, but I think it's actually okay the way that it is, even though it's the least picked. Then we move on to our balanced overclocks, where we have Burning Hell. Burning Hell has a 27.4% pick rate, which I'm pretty surprised. I'm actually surprised it's that high. Burning Hell is a really great overclock. This makes it so your minigun overheats quicker, which isn't necessarily a bad thing if you build it so that it doesn't matter if it overheats. Like if you take aggressive venting in tier 5, then it doesn't really matter if it overheats. It's going to come back up quicker than it normally would, and you still do AoE fire damage to everything, which is pretty nice. This also works pretty much as a short-range flamethrower too, which can be really nice if you combine this with like volatile bullets, so it's got some nice synergies there. I think this one's fine. It really rewards you for being very close to enemies, which is usually not a great position for Gunner to be in, especially when you're fighting the minigun, because that means you're probably getting bit by them, but you're dealing a bit more damage. So it rewards good positioning, and overheating your minigun is usually a downside, but in this case you can make it an upside too. So I think the Burning Hell is pretty well designed, and it definitely makes the minigun feel quite a bit different. Then we have the compact feed mechanism. This gives us 800 more ammo for -4 rate of fire. This one has a 4.64% pick rate, so the second lowest out of them. It's kind of interesting that the ammo ones are the least picked for the minigun, because this one can be pretty fun with the minigun. You can go full ammo minigun and have 3,800 rounds, and it takes you a very long time to run out of ammo. That being said, you are cutting down on your potential damage per second because you are messing with your rate of fire. You could just take the tier 1 option to get your rate of fire back up to normal, and then it's just a buff. If you did want to potentially make this a little bit stronger, you could also mess with like the refrigeration rate. I wouldn't suggest messing with like the spin up rate on it, because then it would just kind of outshine a little more oomph. So I feel like if you did that, it might be a little bit more of a popular option to take. I don't think this one's bad either, though. I think it's very specialized as to what you want to do. Then we have exhaust vectoring, which this one has a 5.3% pick rate, also rather low. This one gives you 2 more damage and increases your base spread. Now, if you do want to take this one, it's probably better to take the tier 1 that gives you extra accuracy. then it's still pretty manageable to shoot this. You can still shoot it at very long range. I think that this one is fairly balanced, but I kind of wish that it was a little bit different, because it's kind of a problem that we've seen in other weapons with their overclocks, is that we have 2 or 3 options that are the same or very similar to one another, and there's always going to be one that outshines the other, or in this case 2 that kind of outshine the other one. So exhaust vectoring, I feel like if you gave it maybe more heat per bullet and then maybe gave it hot bullets normally, so it got fire bullets once it hit a certain rate of fire, or a certain like heat meter, I think that would probably be a better choice for it. I don't think it would outcompete something like Burning Hell then, because Burning Hell would be more specialized towards like area damage, and this one would be more centralized towards like single target fire damage. I think that would be one way you could buff it. I think it's okay as it is. It's still a pretty good overclock. I use it pretty regularly, but it can feel like it's getting a little bit outshined by like a little more oomph, which is just a bonus, no downside. And by Leadstorm, which is a bigger bonus, but potentially a bigger downside. Then we move on to our unstable overclocks, and first up we got Bullet Hell. This one's pretty awesome, at least it's super fun to use. This one has a 13.9% pick rate. This one gives every bullet a 75% chance of bouncing off of any surface, this includes enemies as well, into another enemy within 6 meters, but we lose out on 3 damage and we have 6 times the base spread. Now, I definitely go with the accuracy bonus in this one so that we can actually still be hitting stuff at like medium range. I like how this one works though, where you have bullets that can bounce around corners, bounce into other enemies. It's really good for taking care of like swarmers and just regular crowds. It will struggle against big enemies though. So it does have a con. It definitely has a really high fun factor too, at least for me. But it does come with some downsides, and it can be a little bit inconsistent because you can run through ammo really fast with Bullet Hell. So I think that this one's fine the way that it is. I like that it changes the weapon as much as it does. And even if it's just for the fun factor of it, I think that that's okay. I like the overclocks that really change how the gun functions, or to where you can use them in different situations. So I'm a big fan of Bullet Hell. I think it's well designed. And then our last overclock, which is our most picked one, Leadstorm at 30% pick rate. This one gives us 4 more damage per shot, but we have 0 movement speed. When firing this, we lose our stun chance and stun duration quite a bit too. So you can still technically move with Leadstorm. There's a couple ways that you can do this. You can get onto a moving object like Molly or Dottie, in which case then you can still be firing from it. If you're on Molly, it's going to be very inconsistent as to where she goes, but you can still do it. Dottie, you know she's going in a straight line usually, so you can just stand on the back of her and be firing from that and not really worry about having no movement speed. You can also be on your zip line and move around, which is a possibility. You can just go back and forth on it. And you can do the bunny hop technique as well, where you fire it and then kind of jump when you hit the ground, stop firing it, so that you still have momentum to be hopping either forward, backward, or side to side. And this one I do like. I like the concept of it. It turns you into a turret more or less, or I think that's what they were going for, where you have more damage, but you can be punished easier because you're not moving from that position. So in that way, I think it's pretty well designed, and I think the way that the community has kind of gotten around the downsides of it are pretty inventive. It forces you to play the gun quite a bit differently than you normally would. It might not be an overclock that I pick a whole lot, because I usually go with exhaust vectoring or a little more oomph more often if I want damage, but this one does provide the most amount of single target damage that the minigun can have, and if you're not getting focused by anything, then it's extremely strong, or if you're standing inside your shield, then it's extremely strong because no enemies can bother you, and you just get a wail on them with Leadstorm. So I think that this one's fine too. I don't think I would change this. Out of all the overclocks for the minigun, I think most of them are pretty well balanced. I would maybe change 2 of these that aren't picked so much. I'm not sure if I would change compact feed mechanism. I think it's okay the way that it is. Alright, then we move on to the Thunderhead Heavy Autocannon, which has some really cool overclocks. It has 6, and I think that all of these overclocks are actually really good. The most popular picked overclock is the Neurotoxin Payload, which I think is probably the strongest overclock here. At least for crowd control, maybe not for like single targets if we're talking about that. Neurotoxin Payload has a 25% pick rate, and the least picked overclock is the Composite Drums, which has a 7.3% pick rate, which is still pretty good. Starting off with Composite Drums, this one gives you 100 extra ammo and cuts down on your reload time. Reload time can be a little bit useful with the autocannon because you can reload cancel the autocannon and make up a little bit more time, so this does help with that. You could also just ignore the reload time entirely though if you run Born Ready with the autocannon and just let that reload your gun. The 100 extra ammo, really nice to have. I really like ammo overclocks and ammo mods just in general. This one is a little bit less necessary. You can go full ammo with the autocannon and have 770 rounds spare with it, which is pretty insane. You're probably not going to run through ammo very quick with that, but it's a little bit unnecessary if you do plan on taking the expanded ammo bags in Tier 1. Now, if you're not as big a fan of expanded ammo bags, you could go with something like the high capacity magazine and still take this, and then you get half of your Tier 1 there, which is a pretty good option too. So this one I don't think really needs to be changed. I think it's a good clean overclock. Our second clean overclock is splintering shells. This gives us one more area damage and gives us a slightly bigger AoE radius for those shots. This one has an 8.8% pick rate, which is pretty good. This one is really strong. I would say that this one gets kind of underpicked just because it's a clean overclock. One problem that there is kind of with the autocannon's overclocks is that we have 3 AoE overclocks, and there's naturally going to be one that gets picked more than the other. And honestly, I think this one is one of the better ones because it doesn't really mess with any of your values, and you can still build this for single target damage or you can build it for AoE. Either way, it's still going to help out with the autocannon. So however you like using it, it's still quite good, and I don't think this one needs to be changed at all. I think it's actually really strong. Up next we have Carpet Bomber for our balanced overclocks. This gives us 3 more area damage, a larger AoE radius, but we get less direct damage. This one does make it so we're specializing in AoE and AoE damage, which is a really good thing. This makes it really easy to crowd control. The Carpet Bomber has a 23% pick rate, which is pretty high. I know Carpet Bomber has always been a rather popular overclock, but I have kind of since moved away from using it that much. It's still a good overclock, especially for crowds, but I find it to be a little bit less useful in a lot of situations than something like splintering shells, which can be used better against single targets than Carpet Bomber can. And I also really like the neurotoxin payload, which is even better for crowds because it can spread out an AoE status effect to all of them, dealing damage over time and slowing them. That I find to be a bit better than what Carpet Bomber does. Carpet Bomber is still pretty good. I don't think it actually needs to be changed. I think it's fine the way that it is. Then we have Combat Mobility, which has a 12.2% pick rate. I'm actually kind of surprised. I would have thought that Combat Mobility might have the least picked pick rate because it is kind of an odd overclock, although I do like this one. This one increases our movement speed while we're firing the gun from 50% up to 85%, so we're not as slowed down as we normally would be. This also increases our minimum rate of fire, our rate of fire is scaling, and it makes our spread better. However, we lose out on half of our magazine size. Now you can just take the magazine upgrade in Tier 1 and negate that entirely, and then you're just left with a more accurate, faster firing gun, and you can also move around quicker with it, which is pretty nice. You could also just embrace it. I've done that in a couple of videos too, and if you go with the full rate of fire build, at least the full rate of fire build-up build, then you hit max rate of fire with the Tier 5s, either one of these that rely on your max rate of fire. You hit them after 2 bullets, so you can either get more damage on that or you can get tankiness, which is really nice. I like that it can synergize really well with some of these other builds, and I do like running as the tank build. I think it's one of the best versions of the autocannon if you want to run the tank. This one I think is perfectly fine the way that it is. The downside is kind of minor for how many upsides you get, which is a little bit surprising, but the downside is significant because it does cut your magazine size in half. And one of the downsides to the autocannon is reloading it. It takes a while to reload. So I think that that's fair because the downside is bigger than it actually seems. Then we have Big Bertha for our first unstable overclock with a 23.2% pick rate. Actually, it has the exact same pick rate as Carpet Bomber. I'm kind of surprised at that. Big Bertha gives you more direct damage and less base spread, but we lose out on half of our magazine, we lose out on total ammo, and we lose out on our maximum rate of fire. These are all pretty significant downsides, but the upside is that you get a really heavy hitting gun that can shred through single targets very easy. It's also still pretty good against crowds, so I think Big Bertha is pretty well designed, especially since we don't have anything else that really helps with our direct damage. Everything else is more area damage or utility, and one that scales up your just base damage is really nice. So I don't think there's anything wrong with Big Bertha. I would keep it the way that it is. And then our last one is Neurotoxin Payload. Neurotoxin Payload gives us a 50% chance to inflict neurotoxin on enemies. This is poison damage that deals damage over time and slows all enemies. This also increases our AoE radius by 0.6 meters, which is pretty nice. It's the same radius increase as Carpet Bomber, but we lose out on direct damage and we lose out on area damage. Now the direct damage and area damage really doesn't matter all that much because now our single target damage has gone down because of that, but our effective crowd control has gone much higher up. So we can splash poison to multiple enemies. If you combine this with the fear in tier 5, that's when it gets really crazy, because everything's getting feared, everything's running away, everything's slowed down, and everything's taking damage over time. That's what makes this build so strong in a crowd control sense. Without the fear, it's still pretty strong. It still kills hordes very fast. This one, in my opinion, is probably the strongest for the autocannon, just because it gives you so much crowd control, and I don't know how I would really balance this one a bit more. I feel like, if anything, this one needs to be nerfed a little bit, maybe with the percent chance of poison, just a little bit less chance of splashing poison. It might not be as strong as it is, or at least as oppressive as it can kind of feel against crowds. Aside from that, though, I don't know how else you would really balance it, because lowering the damage even more doesn't matter. You're just mostly using this for the AoE damage and for the splashing poison onto enemies. So I don't know. This is one of the few overclocks that I would potentially nerf, but I'm not entirely sure how, just because this one feels really strong. That being said, I still really like this overclock too. I think it's really good. Then we move on to the newest primary, the Hurricane Guided Rocket System. And we don't have any data on this one, so I'm just going to speculate as to which overclock has probably picked the most and probably picked the least. If I had to pick one for this, I think the most picked would probably either be Salvo Module or maybe Plasma Burster Missiles. I think that those two might be the most picked. The least picked, I would say, is Manual Guidance Cutoff with the Clean, which I don't think actually gives you that much of a buff, if any buff at all. So let's talk about that one first. So Manual Guidance Cutoff makes it so once you release the trigger, you disable the guidance system. So the rockets will no longer go where you move the gun around. They'll just go in a straight line of where they were already going. This also increases the velocity of the rockets, so you do get a little bit faster moving rockets. And this one, I really feel like it should be changed, because this one feels pretty awful to use in my opinion. I do not like it at all. If you wanted to cut the manual guidance system off, you can already do that with the regular Hurricane by just switching to your pickaxe or switching to your secondary, and you don't have to worry about that anymore. So this only really gives you the extra velocity in practical terms, and the extra velocity is not way groundbreaking or anything. You already have an option in tier 2 to do that, but that also increases the turn speed, which is even more useful for this. So this one I feel like should be changed with either having a far faster moving velocity once the manual guidance system cuts off, so just give it like 500% movement speed. So that way you could potentially use it to fire a couple shots at something way far away and then switch off it and have the rockets move very fast to the target. I think that'd be one way to do it. Another way is that they're permanently locked onto whatever target you were already firing at, assuming that it doesn't like burrow or something like that. Just have it go right to that target, because even if you did have that, you're likely not going to be shooting out very many rockets to that target. You're going to be shooting out, 2 to 4 probably, depending on how long a range you are, and then just have them lock on so they just fly right to that target. I think that would be ways to rework this one and make it better, because right now it's pretty underwhelming in my opinion. Our next overclock is not underwhelming. This is the overtune feed mechanism. This one increases our velocity almost by the same amount, and it also increases our rate of fire. Rate of fire is really good with the Hurricane, especially if you stack this with other rate of fire. You don't even need to, but it is kind of funny to stack full rate of fire on the Hurricane. You can do a lot of damage really quick, and I think this is probably one of the better overclocks for the Hurricane just in general. It gives it a nice quality of life bonus, and I don't think it's overpowered by any means. I think it's just good. Then we've got the Fragmentation Missiles. This one increases our area damage and increases our AoE radius. This is more for crowd control, which is kind of cool. I don't really know how you would change this one if you wanted to. I think this one's okay as well. Maybe give it a little bit more area damage, or maybe even give it a bigger AoE radius. I think that would be a little bit of a nice buff for it to have, because this one doesn't feel like it has as big an explosion radius, and I don't think it does as like the autocannon does. So maybe give the rockets a little bit more like AoE, because even going full AoE, it's not bad, but it feels like it could be better. Then moving on to our balanced overclocks, we've got Plasma Burster Missiles. This one's a really cool one. This one makes it so missiles are no longer destroyed. They have to blow up multiple times. They act like a plasma burster grenade that the engineer has. You can have multiple missiles in the air. The missiles can last quite a while. They get additional turn rate. They lose out on direct damage, area damage, AoE radius, and velocity. You also lose out on ammo. So you get a lot of losses for this. I'm kind of surprised that this one's not considered an unstable with how many downsides it has. The upsides are pretty great though, because you can potentially get a lot of value out of this if you're willing to use your rockets to go through multiple enemies, or to just swarm a single enemy they can do a lot of damage that way. This one does kind of have its own special feature though too, and that is on escort missions. One rocket will destroy the rocks entirely. That's never been changed, so I'm assuming it's just a feature of the overclock. It's really good against big targets. It can be really good against swarms. It does require pretty good positioning, and it's going to take you a while to get used to this one because it's very odd compared to the other overclocks. I really like it. I like the way that it changes the hurricane and super fun overclock. Maybe making it unstable overclock just because it feels more like that, but I don't know. Then we have mine layer system. This one is also an interesting overclock. This one makes it so whenever your missiles impact with the ground, they stick into the ground and then take a second to arm so that they become mines. If anything walks across it or walks near it, it will explode, dealing damage. The damage is based off your area damage, as well as these have increased radius. These only last for 15 seconds though, so you can't stack them like you can proximity mines. This one comes at the cost of you no longer having a manual guidance system at all, so where you shoot is where the rockets go. You also lose out on maximum ammo, but not too much maximum ammo. Mine layer system is a very unique overclock. I know a lot of people really love it. I know a lot of people really hate it. Pretty much for the same reasons. If you can set this up ahead of time to where you know enemies are going to go, or where enemies just happen to run through, or you're more patient and kind of walk around your minefield so that enemies walk through it and get blown up, you can get a lot of value out of this. But it is a little bit frustrating when you keep firing at enemies and then they just keep running away from your minefield, so you're losing value overall in the rockets. I think that this one's fine because it does come with a pretty big downside. The upside is still there, and I like that it changes the weapon a lot, so mine layer system I think is perfectly fine the way that it is. Next up we got jet fuel homebrew with our unstable overclocks. This gives us more direct damage, more max velocity, and a higher starting velocity. However, we lose out on area damage, AoE radius, and ammo, as well as magazine size. This one I really like. I think it's really good. This makes it so you can kill bugs directly very fast. It's really good at single target damage. The downsides are pretty significant. It does kind of specialize your weapon, but if you have a secondary that can take care of crowds, it's pretty good. So I think jet fuel homebrew is pretty balanced the way that it is. I don't think it's overpowered or anything. I think it's just good. And then we have salvo module, which this one's kind of a weird one for it to be an unstable one. This one seems like it's more of a balanced one because it kind of changes the way the weapon works, but it doesn't have a significant downside. So when you hold down your trigger, you can load up to 9 missiles for a single shot. You can also shoot this with less than 9 missiles, so if you just charge it to 5, you can fire 5 missiles. The charge rate is based on your rate of fire, so usually it's best to go with rate of fire with this. The starting velocity and max velocity is increased by this, and for each missile that you have charged, you'll do extra damage with this. But in exchange, whenever you're charging up these, your manual guidance system is cut off. It's not cut off when you're single firing the rockets though, and you can just fire one rocket at a time and still have them go wherever you want. So this doesn't come with that much of a downside because the base gun is still the same. You just can't hold down the trigger anymore and keep firing it and guiding them. If you do that, then you get essentially a rocket shotgun. The downside is really not much of a downside, and that's why it seems kind of weird that this one is an unstable overclock. So if anything, the main thing that I would do with the Hurricane is maybe switch salvo module and plasma burster missiles as a balanced and as an unstable overclock. Just switch them around. So then plasma burster missiles becomes your unstable, and then salvo module becomes a balanced overclock, because they kind of feel more that way. That being said, I don't think I really have any problems with salvo module. I think that the concept is super fun. Now moving on to secondaries, we have the Bulldog Heavy Revolver, and we do have percentages for this one. So our most picked overclock for the Bulldog Heavy Revolver is Magic Bullets, which isn't too surprising. Magic Bullets is pretty awesome. And then for our least picked overclock, we have Homebrew Powder, which I'm kind of surprised that one is, although this might be when Homebrew was a clean overclock and didn't become a balanced overclock. So starting out with our one clean overclock, we have Chain Hit. This has a 4.5% pick rate. This one makes it so any shot that hits a weak spot has a 75% chance of ricocheting into another enemy within 5 meters. This one is an overclock that you throw on when you don't have anything else, and I kind of wish that wasn't the case. I wish that this one was stronger. Potentially give it another chance of bouncing into enemies, or even if you hit the ground nearby, it has a chance to bounce into enemies, but have it, maybe scaled less. We have Homebrew Powder. This one randomizes your damage, so you can either deal between 75% of your total damage or up to double damage per shot. This is randomized on every shot. This one can be kind of strong, but it can also feel a little bit inconsistent. That's kind of the whole gimmick of this one. I usually don't use it all that much because I'd rather just keep my revolver feeling the same. Overall, it's just not a super appealing overclock to me. And I don't know if I'd really change it at all, because it feels like one of those overclocks that it's just not made for me. I'm not going to use it that much. If it's made for somebody else, that's awesome, and I hope that they have a lot of fun with it, but for me, I'm probably going to pass. Then we have Volatile Bullets, which has a 22% pick rate. Volatile Bullets gives us 300% more damage towards enemies that are burning. We lose out on 10 direct damage from our revolver, and whenever anything is burning, we do extend the heat meter on an enemy so they might burn longer. Volatile Bullets is really strong. I think it got even stronger with the new primary being added, because it's very easy to put the napalm rounds onto the Hurricane and then set something large on fire and use Volatile Bullets to clean it up. Really good for taking care of anything big. You can take care of Spitballers, Oppressors, Praetorians, and of course you're probably going to be running like the Incendiary Grenades with this. The downside is not that big of a deal, especially if you only want to use this to highly specialize at killing big stuff. Then the direct damage nerf doesn't matter at all, and you can take one of the damage buffs to get back to that 60 damage, which is pretty nice, because if you do hit 60 damage, then on any difficulty you can one-shot headshot grunts. With the 50 damage, you don't quite have enough damage to one-shot headshot grunts, so I don't know if I would change Volatile Bullets. I think it's fine the way that it is. Then we have 6-shooter. 6-shooter increases our magazine size, so we actually have 6 bullets in our revolver. That's kind of nice. We get extra ammo, we get double the rate of fire, although we have increased base spread, although we have a slightly longer reload. So this one is kind of just fun to use. It's pretty strong. This one has a 19% pick rate, so if you like to shoot your revolver really quick, this one's pretty awesome. 6-shooter's fine. It's kind of just a fun overclock to use. I don't think it makes the gun OP or anything like that. I think it's just a nice overclock. Then we move on to our unstable ones, where we have Elephant Rounds, which has a 25.6% pick rate, which is only 0.3 pick rate lower than Magic Bullets, which I'm kind of surprised at. So Elephant Rounds gives you double your direct damage. However, you lose out on magazine size, you lose out on ammo, your reload takes longer, your base spread is better actually. Your recoil per shot and your spread per shot is increased quite a bit. So this one has a lot of downsides for just giving you a really powerful sniper rifle, more or less, as a secondary. By itself, I don't think Elephant Rounds is necessarily overpowered either, because you really get punished for not being able to hit your shots. Your shots that you do make, especially on like weak spots, are very rewarded, and I think that's the way that it should be. You also can't really spam fire Elephant Rounds unless you're like point blank with it, and at that point it's really not best to be using Elephant Rounds in the first place. So I think that all the downsides are pretty much worth the upside that you get for it, and definitely turn this revolver into more of a mini sniper rifle that you just have. Or actually, it's pretty much stronger than a sniper rifle in this game. And then our last overclock is Magic Bullets. Magic Bullets makes it so every time that you impact terrain, this automatically tries to ricochet into another nearby enemy within 5 meters. This also gives you more ammo, but it cuts down on your direct damage. Now, Magic Bullets by itself, I don't think is overpowered or anything like that, but when you put it with a specific build, mostly going with the explosive rounds in tier 3 and going with the neurotoxin rounds in tier 5, that's when it gets really strong. But you do have to build for this, and this just makes it so you can then splash poison onto any enemy nearby, and that's really easy when you're not really trying to hit something directly. You're trying to hit indirectly or trying to hit multiple targets so that you can then have the explosion splash onto them, have the bullet jump into another enemy, and then this explosion plus the bullet has a chance of triggering the poison. So then you start dealing damage over time, and it turns the revolver into a really effective crowd control weapon. So I feel like this build might be potentially overpowered, but I don't think Magic Bullets is the sole reason as to why this is overpowered. So I'm not sure if I would really change anything about Magic Bullets. I also don't know if I would really change anything about the tier 3 and the tier 5 for the revolver either, because explosive rounds outside of Magic Bullets isn't really that great, and the neurotoxin coating is good on every revolver build that you want to use it on, but it's not overwhelmingly overpowered because the revolver's already doing really high damage to whatever you hit. It's just when you combine all of these things together is when you get something that's really strong. And then our last gun is the Burst Pistol, and the Burst Pistol's most picked overclock is Lead Spray with a 37.9% pick rate. That's pretty high. The least picked is actually probably our least picked overclock that we've seen so far, and that is Full Chamber Seal at only 1.6% pick rate. Let's talk about our first clean overclock, which is composite casings. This one has a 14.1% pick rate, which gives us more max ammo and a faster rate of fire. This one's a nice clean overclock. I think it's good. I think this is the only one that messes with our rate of fire. Well, no, the Compact Mags does too. But this is the only one that increases it, which is pretty nice. And the increased ammo is really nice. You can run this with any build and it's pretty good. So I don't think composite casings needs to be changed at all. Then we move on to full chamber sill, which gives us 1 direct damage and gives us a slightly faster reload speed. It's pretty low, but it is there. This one has the lowest pick rate that we've seen, and this one probably needs to be buffed or needs to be changed. I would probably say changed would be a better option because we already have 2 other overclocks that give us damage with experimental rounds and lead spray. So I really feel like this one should probably be changed to something else. Maybe keep the name of full chamber seal, maybe take away the direct damage, give it more reload speed, and maybe give it a larger magazine size or something like that. Or maybe give it an automatically higher burst size. That could be something that you could do, and then it would still be an option and it wouldn't be directly competing with the other damage options. I don't know if you would just want to buff the direct damage and the reload speed of it, because then it might outcompete something like experimental rounds or lead spray. For our balanced overclocks, we have compact mags. This gives us increased maximum ammo, decreased rate of fire, and decreased reload speed. This one has a 10% pick rate. This one's pretty good too. I don't really have any problems with it. I think that the upsides and downsides are pretty fair to it. And if you want to use the burst pistol as more of a general purpose option, then this one works really well for that. So I'd keep this one the same. Then we've got experimental rounds, which has a 12.9% pick rate. This increases our direct damage by 9, lowers our magazine size, and lowers our maximum ammo. This one's really good. I don't think that this one needs to be changed either. The direct damage is really nice for it to have. You can build this to where you can one burst body shot grunts, but if you do that, you don't have very much ammo overall. So you can run through bullets pretty quick. So I like the build options with it, and I think it's fair the way that it is, so I'd keep experimental rounds probably the same. Then we move on to our unstable overclocks. Our first one is electro minelets. This one has a 10.4% pick rate. This one's pretty cool. I like this one. This one lowers your overall magazine size and lowers your direct damage, but we get electro minelets, so when we shoot these down, these minelets take a second to arm, and then when an enemy walks near them or across them, this electrocutes them, dealing damage over time. So the direct damage nerf is not too big. I do like running this with blow-through rounds, because then you can shoot through an enemy and have the electric round still sitting underneath them and then set off. That's a pretty good option. Electricity damage is really nice. It synergizes really well with other classes, like if you have an engineer running Stubby, or if you have a scout running the Zukovs. It does provide more utility, and this is really good for crowd control, because when you're electrocuting enemies, you're slowing them down too and dealing damage over time. So if you do have a high damage primary weapon that's really good at single target damage, like Big Bertha or Lead Storm or Jet Fuel Homebrew, this one works as a really good secondary for taking care of crowds. I really like the concept of electro minelets. I don't think it's overpowered at all. I think that's a fun overclock to use, so I don't have any problems with it. Then we have micro flechettes. Micro flechettes is kind of an interesting one. This one has a 12.9% pick rate, the same as experimental rounds. This one gives you a larger magazine size by 30, which is pretty huge, double your maximum ammo, and cuts down on your spread by half, so your gun is pretty accurate. It also cuts down on your recoil by half, but the big downside of this one is that we lose out on 11 total damage. So you can build this one to make your burst pistol more of a status effect weapon by just stunning enemies constantly, which can be really good in groups. Or you could try to make up for this with just going with full damage, which is another option. Either way, it makes the gun feel a little bit awkward and a little bit different. It's very easy to actually hit targets at long range with this though, which I really like. Don't know if I would change micro flechettes, because you get a whole lot of upsides to this, but the downside is pretty significant, and it definitely changes the way the gun really feels overall. Not necessarily how it plays pretty much the same, but it definitely changes the way that it feels. And then our last unstable overclock is lead spray. Lead spray has the 37.9% pick rate, the highest pick rate of the burst pistol overclocks, and this one is probably my favorite, so I can understand why. This one gives you 1.5 times direct damage, so 150% more damage than you already have, but you have 4 times the base spread of your gun, which makes the burst pistol incredibly inaccurate at longer ranges. At close to medium range, it can still work pretty well, especially at very close range, and this does make it very specialized for dealing high single target damage to big enemies. It works really well on dreadnoughts, it can work really well on oppressors or praetorians or anything you can really get close to. If you can't, then you're going to run into some issues. This can also cause potential issues with your primary weapon if your primary weapon is not very accurate. I think the downside is pretty good though, where it just makes it so the gun is no longer an effective weapon at like that medium to long range, especially to very long range. You're likely not hitting anything with the burst pistol, or maybe you are, but it's not the thing you're aiming at. So I think lead spray is also okay where it is. Not too much to complain about with the burst pistol. The only one I would say that should probably be changed is full chamber seal. There doesn't really need to be a reason for 3 damage overclocks here, especially since if you just buff the numbers on this one, it's probably going to start outperforming these other 2. So that was my thoughts on the Gunners overclocks. Most of them I would say are pretty good. A lot of Gunners overclocks are pretty good choices, and some of them really change the weapons to be super fun. Tell me what your thoughts are on the Gunner overclocks down below. I would love to hear your opinion. Special thanks to the supporters of this channel. These are my members over here on YouTube and my patrons over on Patreon. They get early access to videos like this. And if you'd like to be a part of that, you can. There is a link down in the description. Be sure to check that out. I hope you guys have a great day. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye!